October 19th. After I had returned to the stockade, our Hauptfeldfebel informed me that the pitiful remnants of our battalion were still in the vicinity of the barricade factory. Since I was gradually getting better hearing in my right ear, the next morning, October 20th, I decided to return to the company. If at least some of those who had been lightly wounded and were now fit for duty would soon return to us, it would be advisable to consolidate all our remnants into one unit. I took advantage of this evening to write to all my family. I also performed thorough body care procedures, including a change of underwear, as I did not know when I would next have the opportunity to do so. October 20th. St. Peter was still kind to us as the next day was again clear and sunny. After a hearty breakfast, I headed back to my battalion. It was located about 3 kilometers away. Here I felt relatively safe as the front line was 4 to 5 kilometers away. I watched with interest as our warplanes over my head roared their way into Stalingrad and, as they had been doing for weeks, dropped a load of bombs on the city. For them, too, today's weather was perfect. When would this accursed city finally fall? Never before had the enemy resistance been so fierce and self-sacrificing as here. I remembered Artemovsk on the Seversky Donets River or Voroshilovgrad a little later. The fighting there had been hard, but not as desperate and ruthless as here. I was sure that the reason was that this city bore Stalin's name. The Red Dictator must have realized that he would lose his authority if Stalingrad fell. And it must fall. I was sure of it. I was halfway there. 3 other comrades from the battalion headquarters were with me. Suddenly a thin whistling sound came from the blue sky, and then shrapnel rained down. We threw ourselves to the ground. The same thing happened 4 more times, maybe more. For a while we remained lying flat on the ground, huddled on the ground, waiting to see if another volley would follow. Then we rushed with all our might into the low ground, where we could get out of sight. Thank God, the morning prayer did not require any more casualties. We looked at each other. Herr Lieutenant, what is that on your right arm? One of my traveling companions pointed to 2 small holes in the right sleeve of my tunic. I took it off and found 2 small splinters in my right arm above the elbow. During the sudden fire raid, when we all threw ourselves to the ground, I felt nothing. Nothing. Our battalion Dr. Szczepanski will examine my wound. At least for now, I can still move my arm. Dr. Szczepanski, a medical captain, had saved my life before, when I was wounded in the lung on April 19th. He was quickly on the scene and gave me expert first aid. And this trifle will be just a child's plaything to him. None of us could understand where the shells came from. Most likely, they were fired from the other side of the Volga. We continued on to the regiment CP, and fortunately there was no repeated shelling. When we arrived, we learned the latest news. The regimental commander, Oberst Colonel Gross, had returned from vacation. Oberst Lieutenant, Lieutenant Colonel Muller, and his adjutant Oberlieutenant Krell were transferred to the 267th Grenadier Regiment. Major Weigert was replaced as he had become ill with jaundice. He was replaced by Hauptmann Israel, who had previously been commander of the 13th Company. Together with Colonel Gross, Lieutenant Westernhagen, and Lieutenant Augst and several others who had recovered returned to the regiment. Oberleutnant Polite of the regimental headquarters, he commanded the communications platoon, was buried alive by an exploding aerial bomb. Since the incident occurred at night, no one noticed it, and help arrived too late. We always had to consider the possibility of change after such accidents. Dr. Szczepanski, when I waited for him, treated my wound and confirmed that it was nothing serious. After lunch it rained for the first time in weeks. Hopefully it won't last long. At that time, the order came to move our battalion to an area about 8 kilometers northwest of the barricade plant. The replenishment was to arrive there as well. October 21st. In the morning we set off in battle order for the new location. It was still dark. We had to avoid detection by the observers of the enemy's artillery while it was still dawn. Otherwise, the risk of being exposed to the fire of his guns increased. The farther we were from the main battle arena in the center of the city, the lighter I felt. This city was like Moloch, an insatiable giant. In a few weeks, only a handful of soldiers remained from both battalions after the ruthless urban street fighting. And the situation was no better in other infantry units. When dawn broke, we recognized the settlement on our left. It was Gorodish. Our way now lay in a northerly direction. At Orlovka, the battalion made a halt. Here I received orders from Lieutenant Schuler to arrive in the mess to the regimental commander, Colonel Grosset. I was taken to the place by a courier on a motorcycle. It was said that it was likely that in a few days we would halt in winter quarters, creating a cut-off position on the northern flank. Probably someone just really wanted to believe in his cherished wish. When a soldier is at war, he never even knows what will happen to him in the next minute, what task he will receive. Our regimental commander was still following with the convoy. With him were about 40 men from the convalescents who had arrived with Lieutenants Augst and Westerhagen. I gave a report to Oberst Colonel Gross. Lieutenant Holly reporting as ordered. My commander thanked me for the greeting and, smiling, remarked, "It took you a long time to find your way back to your regiment." Jal, Herr Oberst, exactly 6 months, including a detour through the 134th Infantry Division. I had already heard of this, as well as of the very heavy fighting the regiment had been engaged in during my absence. The casualties have been extremely heavy. We must endeavor to get as many men as possible to replenish them. Until further notice, we're relegated to Division Reserve. And now for you, Hall. You are the last of the old experienced company commanders left in the regiment. For the last 4 weeks, you've been fighting continuously. Oberstleutnant, Lieutenant Colonel, Muller awarded you a gold wounding badge. Yesterday, you were lucky again. I can't afford to lose the last experienced company commander. You will stay here in the stockade for a few days, and then you will be at regimental headquarters for 4 or 6 weeks. I was not at all happy about this, for such an order was not at all in accordance with my desires. The ties of connection with my sevenths were too precious to me to think of a transfer. I inquired, Herr Oberst, will I get my company back at the end of this period? You will, of course, retain nominal command of your company. Lieutenant Augst will perform your duties for the time being. You will remain my officer for special duties at regimental headquarters, especially now that Oberleutnant Pollitt has so tragically lost his life. Relieved, I replied. I'm grateful to you, Herr Oberst. For the next half an hour, I answered the questions my commander asked me. They mostly concerned the battles we had fought in various parts of the city. I didn't hide anything, because I thought that would be wrong. There was no point in hiding the truth. Otherwise, the higher command would have a wrong picture of what was going on. When they announced the arrival of a courier from the regiment on a motorcycle with a sidecar, I was released. I watched the motorcycle drive away. Colonel Gross was a remarkable man. Judging by the way he looked, his vacation at home had done him good. A pair of pale blue eyes sparkled in a face devoid of even a hint of wrinkles. He was well built. I guessed the colonel to be between 55 and 60 years old. His voice was calm. He spoke measuredly and did not take offense at fair criticism. I considered him a good man. For his age, of course. Now I didn't have to think about my soldiers. I found our treasurer, non-commissioned officer Hallam. Calm and judicious, he had been with the company since its formation. His greeting was genuinely friendly. Soon after him arrived Futtermeister Gregolets, and then the coachman of the horse-drawn wagon, the vehicle at the disposal of the assistant gunner and the rest of the supply men, the Lieutenant Fisher. Each, like a cog in a machine, had his own duties. And without them we, the rest of us, could not function. And so it was in all units, whether they moved on horseback or in vehicles, whether they were infantry, Luftwaffe, Air Force, or Kriegsmarine, Navy. I asked a lot of questions, but I also had a lot to tell myself. Gregulitz took me to the horses. Some of the quadrupeds were in place, including my horse Mumpets. They had all known better days, now they were on the cusp of another harsh winter. The grooms, I am sure of it, were doing the best they could for them, but they could not perform miracles. If tomorrow or the day after tomorrow the weather remains good, I shall take Mumpets and take him for a little ride. Already looking forward to it, I wondered whether the horse would recognize me, his former rider, when I rode him. October 25th. I spent 4 days in the wagon. It was cold. The difference between the relatively peaceful life 10 kilometers behind the lines and the continuous fighting on the front line was palpable. On October 22nd, we watched 60 bombers flying over us towards Stalingrad. Soon we could hear the explosions of bombs even in the mess. Yesterday, I was able to welcome our battalion treasurer, a Burzelmeister Knopp. He stopped by on his way to visit us for a few days, bringing supplies, ammunition, and mail, including 2 letters to me from my wife, dated October 3rd and 15th. At lunchtime, I took a short ride on Mumpitsa. After such a long break, it was a wonderful feeling to sit on the back of a horse again, looking down on the surroundings in good weather. It was as if I had lost myself in time, forgotten the seriousness of the moment, and returned to those happy days in Oberlausitz when I first saddled this sturdy, stocky white gelding. We soon became friends, and in August 1941, when I became commander of the company in which I had previously commanded a platoon, Mumpitz became my riding horse. This horse lived up to his name completely. Even now I had to be wary of him and show him that I was his master. We returned an hour later. The happy hour was over. If the weather continues to be good tomorrow, I will go horseback riding again. October 28th. Thank God, the days of inactivity are over. Last night I received orders to report to the regiment CP today. I plan to report to the regimental commander at Mumpitsa, accompanied by a stable boy. However, I soon received a phone call saying that the commander would drive up himself, as he had some business to attend to in the wagon. I was glad I had time to ride Mumpitsa 2 days in a row. My four-legged friend also enjoyed our walks. He was noticeably lively, frisky, and playful. Who knows when I will be able to ride him again? Oberst Gross arrived at noon. After half an hour, when we had been quickly and fully served in the field kitchen, we went together to the regiment CP, located in a small oak grove near Spartakovka. Spartakovka and Rhinock are two small villages north of Stalingrad, separated from the city by the Orlovka River. The oaks in the so-called forest were too young, no more than 5 meters high. They had already shed almost all their leaves. Nevertheless, the shelter was well hidden from prying eyes. The area of the grove was about 100 by 400 meters, and it looked like a toothbrush. At the CP sat a single officer, Lieutenant Horst Hoffmann. He was a court officer by profession, was born in Plauen, Voigtland, Saxony, and had commanded the 13th Artillery Company before being transferred to regimental headquarters. The regimental adjutant, Oberleutnant Kells, was still on leave at home, but his return was expected any day now. In the meantime, this fortress was held by Lieutenant Hoffmann. I had to give him a helping hand. Hoffmann and I were to sleep in a double room of about 3 square meters. I quickly stowed the rudimentary belongings of an infantryman and intended to use the free time to pass the time by reading the mail I had brought with me in the wagon, but Lieutenant Hoffmann entered the room and invited me to the commander's office. He was already waiting for me, and after I had given my report he looked at me attentively and said, "My predecessor, Oberstleutnant Muller, awarded you the Wounded in Gold badge for your 7th wound in combat with the enemy. He was going to present the award to you personally. Here in the regiment we did not have this badge and had to request it from the division. Yesterday we received it, and now I can pin it to your uniform. I wish you, Holly, good luck as a soldier and all the best." I gladly shook the commander's hand. I was absolutely convinced that my fate was in the hands of the Almighty, and without him we were nothing. And it is senseless to think that we can cheat fate by trying not to fulfill something of what has fallen to our lot. When the Lord decides that your last moment has come, everyone must be ready for it, and pleas or regrets are useless here. The oath I took to the Führer, the nation, and the fatherland will always be sacred to me, especially considering that I took the oath voluntarily at the age of 18. That evening I answered letters from home. At night, the chatter of sewing machines was heard in the sky again. October 29th. The day of October 29th promised to be a weather day. The sun appeared in the east, and even though the nights were already cold, it was possible to warm up a little in its rays. My thoughts often returned to my company. While on duty near our shelter, I found small mines scattered around us and further into the forest. They were ball-shaped, about 10 centimeters in diameter, and had wires coming out of them. If touched, the mine would explode and could cause injury. I reported my observations to the commander, and he immediately ordered me to be careful about such dangerous things. While I was examining one such thing with due caution, an Oberfreier from regimental headquarters came up to me and asked, "Herr Lieutenant, what is it?" "These are small mines that the Ivans scattered at night from their sewing machines." "Are they dangerous?" "Doesn't look like it." "Believe me, they're dangerous. Stay away from things like this. Anything you can't recognize, if it comes from the Ivans, is dangerous. But it clearly can't be such a dangerous thing. I warn you, keep your paws off them." The soldier walked away, but my warning didn't seem to convince him much. At about noon, the first Knight's Cross recipient in our regiment, the commander of the 3rd Battalion, Hauptmann Arthur Rittner, appeared before Colonel Gross. He reported that he was leaving for his Sonderurlaub. Rittner especially distinguished himself in the battles in the southern part of Stalingrad. We were all happy for him. Rittner was a Zollfinder and had received his military training while still in the Reichswehr. Some of my teachers had also once served in the Reichswehr, such as my old company commander. If it had not been for cadres from the Reichswehr, our leaders would not have been able to create the Wehrmacht in such a short time. On leaving home on leave, Hauptmann Rittner took with him all the letters from us to our homeland, which he intended to send from Breslau. Thus, we thought, It would take only a few days to deliver the letters. There was another piece of good news. My old, universally respected commander, Major Zimmerman, had been awarded the German Cross in Gold. He was still at home on medical leave. The days were getting shorter and shorter. In daylight, we tried to do all the bureaucratic work we had accumulated, as in any other headquarters. Otherwise, we would have had to work by the light of the Hindenburg lanterns. In addition, we were given some captured kerosene lamps. October 30th. On October 30th, we received a delegation from the neighboring 16th Panzer Division. The commander of the 79th Motorized Regiment, Oberst Reinisch, arrived with his adjutant, Oberleutnant Bringen. They were accompanied by several other men. The 79th Motorized Regiment, like our unit, had been in heavy fighting and, like us, had suffered heavy losses. It now took up positions on our left. With the exception of 2 colonels, the other officers were my countrymen from Rhineland and Westphalia. The familiar accent of their native home sounded like music to my ears. The main topic of conversation between the 2 colonels was the situation on the front line in the section of both regiments, and how difficult it was in this connection to advance in the direction of Rhinock and Spartakovka towards the Volga. In Colonel Reinisch's opinion, this sector could safely be called the Second Verdun, since hardly an inch of ground could be found there that was not torn up by bomb and shell explosions. In addition, he added, because of this it was impossible to use tanks in this area. The enemy resistance here still could not be broken. It was interesting to watch the meeting of the 2 commanders. Reinisch came from Sturmark and displayed good manners. My commander Gross was not much different from him. In my opinion, they were both old school knights from whom I could learn a lot. Our guests invited us to pay them a return visit on the condition that the general atmosphere would permit it. Gross replied that he would gladly do so. Then he turned to us. It is always good to know your comrades from other units personally. This is important for possible joint actions in the future. All I had to do was agree with him. October 31st. October is almost over. Fighting is still raging in the city. Almost nowhere had we been able to make a significant advance. We were too weak numerically to advance again. We could only hold our ground here in the quiet sector. 6 months ago, at the mouth of the Tsaritsa, when we were advancing at an almost constant pace, I wrote to my wife, maybe only a few days will pass and we will take Stalingrad. Now winter was almost upon us. Fresh forces were needed to capture the rest of the city. The morale of the soldiers was high, and we had full confidence in our command. We received a call from division headquarters informing us of General Pfeiffer's visit. He had been with us since the unfortunate accident that happened to our 1st Division commander, Infantry General Volkmann. I was instructed to arrive at the regimental commander's office. After Colonel Gross had responded to my greeting, he said with a smile, "The regiment is to assign 1 officer to a company commander training course in Dobritz, west of Berlin. Ed. The training will last from December 6, 1942 to January 16, 1943. From December 22, 1942 to January 2, 1943, all students of the course will receive Christmas leave. On behalf of our regiment, you are being sent. This is a sign of recognition of your merits. I know that you have already completed such courses at the division in the fall of 1940 in Oberlausitz. However, these courses are conducted on the initiative of the OKH and will be useful for your development. Finally, if you are able to give 3 lectures at the course, you may be granted a special leave of absence for 5 days." I could barely understand what I was being told. I listened with a disgruntled expression on my face, which surprised my commander. Lieutenant Hoffman was already aware of this and congratulated me on my appointment. Suddenly a messenger appeared, who, holding his breath, reported. Behind the forest, about 100 meters away, Oberreferei Korneck was blown to pieces by a mine explosion. Suspecting the worst, I hurried to the scene. My fears were confirmed. It was the same guy who had shown such interest in those damn mines the day before yesterday, even though I had insistently pointed out to him the danger they posed. This tragic incident should definitely be reported to all units. Soldiers on the front lines tended to be more careful and alert. The division commander arrived about 13:00. He was accompanied by the regimental adjutant, who had just returned from vacation. After our commander gave the general a report, both officers with their adjutants proceeded to the regimental CP. Lieutenant Hoffman and I were invited to accompany them. The current situation was discussed. The map was extensively used. The general told us that the numbers in the companies of each regiment had begun to increase due to the fact that soldiers were constantly returning from hospitals to the troops after treatment. He was also of the opinion, however, that this was not enough and that fresh reinforcements from Germany were needed. Before getting into his Kubelwagen, the general called me over to him. "Holly, you'll soon be going on a course in Doberitz. Before you leave, find me. My family lives in Potsdam, and I would like you to go there in person to deliver a letter from me." I exaggeratedly cheerfully bellowed. "Jol, Herr General." I still couldn't believe it. In 5 weeks I was to be in Berlin, and then in another 7 weeks I was to meet my family back home. It was hard to believe. Lieutenant Hoffman informed me that following Major Weigert, his adjutant, and my friend, Lieutenant Joachim Schuler, also fell ill and was hospitalized. I hope that his illness was not very serious. November 1st. November started with good weather. The nights got colder, but the days were sunny and clear. With the latest additions, both battalions were now down to an infantry company. Of course, this was still not enough, and we were still too few. We therefore rejoiced at every soldier who reported his return. Among the officers who reported back to the regiment were Lieutenant Pills from Berlin and Lieutenant Baumann from Bavaria. Among those who returned after recovery were many faces of my old acquaintances. Mostly all of them were from Upper and Lower Silesia, which still formed the basis of our regiment, although our originally all-Silesian regiment began to receive natives from other regions of the mother country. Everyone was aware of the seriousness of the situation. Each wanted to be home among friends as soon as possible, but they all did their duty in an exemplary manner. Many became ill with jaundice and had to be hospitalized. Dr. Szczepansky kept talking about the monotony of rations, which happened after we crossed the Don. Our army could be supplied by the only road through Kaliknadonu, which caused difficulties in bringing in many foodstuffs. The result was an increase in cases of hepatitis, which had previously been quite rare in the units. November 2nd. Today, November 2nd, was another clear day, and we decided to pay a return visit to our neighbors. With our commander, his adjutant Oberleutnant Keltz, and I went by car to the 79th Motorized Regiment CP. We were warmly welcomed by Herr Oberst Colonel Reinisch and his staff officers. We stayed with them for lunch, to which we were invited. Even here there were no excesses in the form of sausage, but if you were hungry, even the vegetable soup, aptly called barbed wire by the soldiers, was good. The main topic of conversation was again a broader discussion of the general situation in Stalingrad and our fears caused by the fact that the enemy was still occupying Rhinock and Spartakovka. Colonel Reinisch also told us that the tank units of the 16th Panzer Division had to constantly fulfill the role of fire brigades. I took the opportunity to talk to a distant relative who commanded a communications platoon in the 1st Battalion. We had never seen each other before, but decided to catch up if possible. When at about 3 p.m. we returned to the regiment CP, it was already dark. The whole day was quiet at the front. Nothing much happened on November 3rd and 4th. I would say that our world is small. Shortly before dark, a PK reporter showed up at our headquarters, whose task was to take photos of life on the front lines and write a report accordingly. You'd think you could take good pictures in such a cramped space. The reporter introduced himself, Hermann. Later, sitting in my shelter, I struck up a conversation with him. I could tell from his accent that he was a native of Rhineland. I asked, "Herr Hermann, I hear you're from Rhineland. What city?" "I'm from Duisburg." "Me too. More specifically, I was born in Duisburg, in the district of Lahr, and I know Hermann. He had a serious bicycle accident as a child." "That's my brother." "Well, then why don't I know you?" "Herr Hall, I am 12 years older than my brother and have been away from home for more than 10 years. I now live in Valais, in Berlin." We had a long talk about our home and mutual acquaintances. The situation in our sector remained calm, and the next morning, before leaving, my fellow countrymen took a few pictures here. November 6th. Since 0300 hours, Colonel Grosset and I have been on the move. We've been to the very front lines, including my 7. Lieutenant Augst is carrying out his duty competently and accurately. I was pleased when my Silesians asked me, "Herr Lieutenant, when are you going back to your company?" My commander heard this and grinned. The weather was foggy and it was dripping rain. When we got back to the CP at about 14.30, both my colonel and I were tired and exhausted. It was cold at night. It looks like the time for good weather is over. At least it's better to stay dry and freezing than to get wet. If we are to spend the winter here, the big problem will be finding something with which to keep warm. The regiment has requested the division to send winter uniforms as a matter of urgency, as well as white camouflage. We need them to send all this before it is too late. The first snowfalls are coming soon, and by then, at least in the forward units, camouflage clothing should be available. Up to now, our soldiers have been wearing the usual uniforms: 2 pairs of underwear, 2 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of underpants, 2 pairs of underpants, 1 pullover, pants, tunic, cap, 1 pair of gloves, steel helmet, overcoat, piece of cloth, trench coat, bread bag with canteen supplies, 1 pair of short leather boots known as noble betchers. But for the cold Russian winter with its brutal cold, this set was clearly not enough. The winter uniform consisted of a pair of quilted cotton pants and the same tunic. Both of these garments could be worn on either side and could be worn over the summer uniform. In winter, when there was snow, the winter uniform was worn with the top white side out, and after the snow melted, it was turned out so that the other side was the camouflage color. In addition, the soldier received felt boots. For the Russians, winter uniforms were the order of the day. Here they were more often than not better dressed than we were. Our camouflage for snowy winters was made artisanally. This included a white sheet with a hole for the head and 2 slits for the arms. This camouflage was intended to make it difficult to spot soldiers in the snow. The weather started to change. It became cold and very windy. It rained yesterday, and it was very slippery outside. This made it very difficult for our supply wagons to bring in food. It also made fighting in the front line very difficult. The entire regimental headquarters was busy looking for winter uniforms for the soldiers on the front line. November 15th. I had heard that the Americans and British had landed in North Africa, but I had no time to get into these more general matters. We had other problems to deal with. Hauptfeldfebel Michel arrived and reported that he was going home on leave. He had honestly deserved it, for, being a bachelor, he had repeatedly yielded his turn to those who had families. And now he hadn't been home for almost a year and a half. I wished him all the best and a safe return to his unit. Feldfebel Kupel will take his place. He was from Sudetenland, Germany, and had served in the Czechoslovak army. Mail from home brought me sad news. Several of my childhood friends and buddies were killed or missing at sea when their submarine was sunk during a combat patrol. The commander told me that I must leave on November 25th for the company commander's training course. That is still 10 days away. November 16th. We were again transferred to the 79th Motorized Regiment. It happened on November 16, 1942. At that time, Colonel Reinish's CP was discussing the offensive in the area of Rhinock and Spartakivka. Both our regiments were to attack next to each other. The strike was to be delivered unexpectedly. We could not count on the support of tanks, as the nature of the terrain did not allow their use. In addition, the tank units again had to fulfill the role of fire department. The beginning of the offensive was scheduled for the morning of November 17th. We were to be supported by the artillery of the 16th Panzer Division. Since the 79th Motorized Regiment had also managed to increase its combat strength in recent weeks after the return of soldiers and officers who had dropped out due to wounds and illness, the Corps headquarters believed that our 2 regiments were capable of capturing both areas. November 17th. The offensive was only hours away. This meant that none of us had time for any rest. Orders had to be transmitted to the troops. Where this could not be done by telephone, the orders were delivered in writing by messengers. If it was something particularly important, a regimental staff officer had to be present at battalion headquarters. By the time everyone was notified, time had passed. Finally, there was only 1 hour left before the start of the rush forward. Everyone was thinking, would it work this time? Will the enemy be taken by surprise? Doubts and questions that could only be answered later. A few days before, both regiments like ours, the 267th and 274th Grenadier Infantry regiments, had been transferred to positions along the northern blocking line, which stretched from the Don to the Volga in a facet, mostly to the north. We, too, were to be transferred to these positions for the winter. However, before that moment came, we first of all had to fulfill the tasks of the offensive. Since I was the commander of the 7th Company, assigned to regimental headquarters for only 6 weeks, my thoughts naturally kept returning to the soldiers of my company. As had often been the case in recent weeks, they were once again faced with an extremely difficult task. The natives of both Silesia were to operate alongside my countrymen from Rhine-Westphalia. The remaining part of the strike group was 1 regiment made up of units from the 24th Panzer Division and the 16th Panzer Division. The soldiers of both of these divisions, both before in this campaign and now in their respective stations, had succeeded in gaining a well-deserved reputation. I myself was but a small cog in this huge machine, with only tactical training and little knowledge of strategy. Yet I had my doubts that our strike would be successful. If someone goes on the offensive from a defensive position, he must have a significant numerical superiority as well as an overwhelming advantage in heavy weapons, which with their fire must pin the enemy to the ground until the breakthrough of his positions is realized. I did not believe that we possessed numerical superiority. I did not know whether we could, with the heavy weapons allocated to us, pin the enemy to the ground during the assault. The terrain was inconvenient for the implementation of tank support. Besides, we did not have them at that moment. When we heard the first sounds of battle to the north of us, we realized that the dancing had begun. It was an unusual feeling for me. I had been directly involved in battles with my soldiers before. On such occasions, you are completely immersed in the battle and often forget about time altogether. Now, for the first time, I was at the headquarters, and my participation was expressed by completely different tasks. Time passed very slowly for me. I could see that our commander, Colonel Grosset, was in doubt as to how the offensive was going. He knew the general situation better than any of us and objected as much as we did to the task assigned to us in the offensive. But at the end of the day, we were all soldiers who had to obey and carry out orders. The combat effectiveness of any army rests on the ability to obey and faith in the command. Its successes and defeats depend on it. By about noon, we began to receive the first data on the progress of the fighting. The offensive had stalled after we had covered about 200 meters. Our heavy weapons were not enough to pin the enemy to the ground. As a result of the fire of the defending enemy, we in both regiments suffered considerable losses, including killed. We could hear the heavy rumble of artillery and mortar fire from both sides, which meant that we were not making much progress. By order of the commander, I went, accompanied by a messenger, to the headquarters of the 2nd and then the 3rd Battalion. The situation of the units of Hauptmann Israel and Oberleutnant Kraus, who had replaced Hauptmann Rittner, was extremely dangerous. Both battalions had no reserves, and any losses were debilitating to the real combat effectiveness of these units. Oberleutnant Kraus stated in his East Prussian dialect, "If things continue like this, we'll have to fight with our young men in the wagon." In my heart of hearts, I agreed with him. Returning to headquarters, I reported the results to Colonel Gross and learned that the neighboring regiment had suffered heavy losses like us and was in a similar position to ours. At this time, it began to grow dark, and the sounds of battle began to die down. Our soldiers had plenty to do. It was necessary to carry the wounded and dead from the field, and to see that the enemy did not counterattack. The Ivans were planting mines in front of their front line, which naturally confused our soldiers. November 18th. November 18th also brought no change in the situation. The offensive was hopelessly bogged down and could not be continued without fresh forces. What the soldiers on the front line had to do was almost beyond human capabilities. Most of them still had no winter uniforms. This meant that they had to operate with what they had. They huddled on the front lines in shelters, with only their Zeltbahn raincoats, to protect them from the wet and cold. The hours therefore stretched on forever for them. Many came out of the battle with their uniforms tattered into rags, to which they reacted laconically, "That's all right. Better rags than my bones." I myself knew it all firsthand, and I understood my soldiers completely. And I was sure of one thing. We would have to pay for everything we had experienced with our health later, if, of course, we were lucky enough to survive the war at all. 6th Army surrounded. November 18th to December 5th, 1942. November 18th. In the evening of November 18th, we received the following order. At night on November 19th, withdraw to the original positions. The unsuccessful offensive operation with heavy losses on our side was over. For the next 3 days, we were engaged in patching up the holes that the losses we had suffered had caused in our ranks. Everyone who could be dispensed with at headquarters was sent to the front lines. We learned from division headquarters that the Russians to the northwest of us had taken the offensive against the Romanians and had broken through their positions on a wide front. The same thing was repeated on November 20th in the south. On November 21st, the regiment learned that the enemy's advanced units had joined up near Kalacha-on-Don, which meant the encirclement of the 6th Army. From the very beginning, it came as a shock to all of us. How could something like this happen? Did everyone up there fall asleep? Did we have no German troops left at all to support the Allied units? We couldn't find answers to these questions. I was sure that the cauldron would not last long. Our command was not born yesterday, and soon the encirclement would be broken through. In addition, we had to keep an eye on what was happening on our section of the front. The northern defensive line had been reliably built at the time when we were striking from the Don to the Volga. The enemy had finally stopped his unsuccessful strikes here. We should have improved and further strengthened our positions in this sector. As for what was happening to the west of us, on the Don, we had no influence on what was happening there. November 23rd. About noon on November 23rd, we received orders to prepare every serviceable wagon, all trucks, cars, and other equipment, fill it with gasoline, and be in readiness to break through in a southwesterly direction. Colonel Gross's inquiry to division headquarters was answered that the order was given by the commander of the Allied Army Corps, to which we belonged, General von Seydlitz. All important documents were ordered to be burned. Anything we could not take with us was to be prepared for destruction. We were to take with us only the essentials, especially ammunition. Fortunately, it was mostly dry, albeit cold. No one was happy about the prospect of starting to fall back again. How much energy and defensive impulse it had cost us infantry soldiers to fight our way to this point. And at the cost of what losses? And now back? My comrades with whom I had the opportunity to talk about it all held the same opinion. We didn't like the idea at all. And finally, we would have to cover the retreat. And this in the face of an inadequate supply of winter clothing and equipment. But more important than all this was the fact that the bread portions for all who remained in the cauldron were reduced to 200 grams, which meant empty stomachs and hunger. And in cold conditions, the body requires more caloric expenditure. Nevertheless, an order is an order. We did everything we were asked to do. We prepared for destruction everything that was unnecessary at that moment, as well as documents, and now waited for further instructions. All thoughts were now centered around how to break through. It was going to be a difficult and costly endeavor. All of us were sure of that. November 24th. On the night of November 23rd to 24th, we barely found time for a short sleep break. For the most part, we only managed to get a little rest. The nervous tension was too great. Even Colonel Gross took part in the general conversations. We talked about everything and nothing, just to pass the time while waiting. From time to time, the commander himself or Oberleutnant Kells would contact the units on the front line to see if the situation had changed. At about midnight, Gross informed us of what was happening. The units and subdivisions of the northern defensive line are carrying out a withdrawal. I hope that they will be able to do it discreetly. For us, however, all this meant that the waiting time would increase. Did anyone realize what was happening? Yesterday, we were all ordered to prepare for a breakthrough. And now, just before noon, we're suddenly told that the breakthrough is canceled. Everyone stay where you are. We were operating surrounded by the enemy, not on maneuvers at a training ground. Therefore, it was possible to do this at first, and after a while, do that anywhere, but not here, where we had to pay for every meter of advance with blood. What was happening at the northern defensive line? Would our comrades be able to retake it? Fortunately, the irreparable had not had time to happen there. Did the Ivans notice our withdrawal? And how would they react to it? One thing was clear to us. Without a breakthrough to the southwest, the next few days would become very difficult for us, unless we recaptured the defensive lines. The next day I was to go west, and mentally I was already at home. But subconsciously, I had constant doubts about it, and I would believe it only after I was actually there. And now, goodbye, beautiful dreams. The reality was quite different. Everyone had to stay where they were. By this time, we learned from division headquarters that the units that were defending the northern defensive position had been pushed back, in some areas up to 4 kilometers. The enemy had already advanced about 3 kilometers from the Barikati factory through Spartakovka to Gumrak. He was now about 1.5 kilometers north of our regiment CP. We received an order, the highest degree of readiness, go on alert. This included all rear services, such as headquarters, wagons, supply companies, etc. The distance was too small for a possible tank breakthrough. Until the general situation became completely clear, we all had to be alert. Nevertheless, we all breathed a sigh of relief, for everyone was sure that we would be rescued from the cauldron by hitting it from the outside. November 25th. On November 25th and 26th, the situation in our section was still unclear. The units withdrawn from the northern defensive line, according to orders, were trying to establish a new line of defense along the single-track railroad north of our regiment CP. Among these units was the 276th Infantry Grenadier Regiment. Fortunately, the Russians pursued us sluggishly. They did not understand what was going on. And how could they understand why we voluntarily abandoned our well-equipped positions now, in winter, whereas during the last months we had persistently repulsed every attempt to seize them? The 274th Infantry Grenadier Regiment deployed on the territory of the tractor plant with its front towards the village of Spartakovka. It was not required to withdraw. After a short treatment in the hospital, my friend Joachim Schuler was assigned as regimental adjutant to this regiment, whose commander was Colonel Brendel. November 27th. Oberleutnant Keltz informed me that the order for my promotion to the rank of Oberleutnant had finally arrived in the regiment. November 28th. In the early morning hours, it was already light. Suddenly the alarm was sounded. Outside, from the north of our shelters, we heard the loud sounds of fighting, which were getting closer and closer. By this time, the Russians realized that our troops had withdrawn from the northeastern section of the defensive position to the north. With the support of tanks, they decided to break through the new front line. First, they tried to capture the area between the heights 135.4, 144.2, and 147.6. Through these landmarks, repeating the outline of the railroad, now past the front line. If the enemy managed to capture at least one of these heights, from above he would have a view of the whole of Stalingrad. This would create a serious inconvenience for our troops. Our artillery and in general everything that could fire made desperate efforts to repel this blow. And all this meant that the front clearly smelled something unspeakably rotten. At about 10 a.m., 2 tanks arrived at the CP, and their crews requested our instructions. Colonel Gross ordered that I personally set the task for the tankers. We set about carrying out his order. It seemed to me that the enemy was concentrating his main efforts on taking the height of 135.4. I ran as fast as my lungs would allow. As a boy, I was a good long-distance runner. Now it came in handy. To my left, I could see Orlovka. Now, over the gully, on the opposite slope, and there it was, height 135.4. I stopped next to the front tank and gestured to the commander that he would have to observe the battlefield behind the height, and then went back. I had to make time now. While I was here, every minute mattered to my fighting comrades. I realized that a few tanks, even if there were only 2, engaging in battle, would give my friends a break. The first shots of tank guns were heard. Bravo, guys, take care of yourselves. The ground was frozen and the weather was clear. Now Orlovka was on my right. It was still at least 2 kilometers away. My path lay in a southward direction. I had almost overcome a slight rise up the slope, which stretched upward for about 40 meters, and had time to step on the next, steeper rise. And then all hell broke loose on me. Stalin's organs. When you experience their influence once or twice almost every day, as it happened to me in recent weeks in the area of the Barricadi factory settlement, you already know what will happen to you by the approaching roar of the rockets. The shells of the organs came from the north, from behind the front line. From the first hit shuddered the opposite side of the beam, about the place where I left both tanks. I looked around like a hunted animal. There was not a scrap of ground visible where I could find shelter. Here I found a small crevice, only about 40 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters deep. It was practically nothing. Never before in my life had I ever wished to be as small as possible. My feet pinned to the ground, face looking down, arms stretched forward. Explosions followed, one after another. I lay unprotected by anything, a helpless piece of flesh provided for this concentrated display of power created by the hands of man. Rockets exploded around me one after another, here and there. Would it never end? Shell fragments howled through the air. I waited and did not realize whether it was reality or a dream. After lying so still for a few minutes, I was completely stunned by this morning blessing. I couldn't tell how many bursts there were in total. At times like this, we forget about numbers and just try to save our own skin. The seconds of rockets bursting around me stretched into an eternity for me. Finally, I came to my senses and realized with complete amazement that I had not received a single wound. Were those rockets intended for our 2 tanks? Or did the Ivan suspect that our troops were here? I did not know that. By the time I arrived at the regiment CP, I had had time to recover from the shock. Colonel Gross paced excitedly around his dugout. He was waiting for my return. He could hear the sounds of the rockets hitting, as it was only a kilometer away from our CP. I reported. Oberleutnant Hall reports back. The tanks have been tasked as ordered. The commander asked me, "Can you see anything from up there?" I replied, "No, Herr Oberst, but it's very easy to come under enemy fire there. Only a few minutes ago, I was hit by rockets in an area where there was no cover, and I am still surprised that I came back in one piece and not in pieces. Please, Herr Oberst, let's go to cover. You go on, Holly, and I'll stay here a while longer." I had only taken 6 steps to the shelter and closed the door behind me when I heard the sounds of explosions outside. The doors had been blown out by a blast wave. One of the pipes of the Stalinist organ exploded right in front of the door. Then the sounds of other explosions were heard closer, then a little farther away. After everything stopped, a soldier burst into the shelter and shouted, "The commander is down!" Keltz, Hoffman, and I looked at each other carefully. Just what we needed. 2 soldiers carried Colonel Gross in and laid him on the board bed. He groaned with unbearable pain, which he tried to stifle. A large piece of shrapnel had penetrated the colonel's abdomen. The regimental doctor was sent for immediately. I was furious at my helplessness. I could not do anything and only reproachfully said to the wounded man, "Why, Herr Oberst, did you not heed my advice?" Overcome with pain, my commander replied, "You were right, Holly, in scolding me. But I wasn't going to reproach the commander at all. If only he had listened to me. But I, a mere Oberleutnant, could not order my colonel to go into hiding." Without wasting time, we immediately sent our commander, who had been given first aid by the regimental doctor and was unconscious after a morphine injection, to the army hospital in Stalingrad. It is unlikely that I will soon be able to forget that day of November 28th. The command continued to function as usual. Regimental Adjutant Oberleutnant Kells took command of the regiment temporarily until a replacement for Colonel Gross had arrived. I learned that the 2 tanks placed in position by me had worked wonders. They appeared literally at the last moment and managed to shoot 4 or 5 T-34 tanks, thus forcing the Russians to retreat. As a result, our soldiers were able to hold the front line along the railroad. November 29th. On November 29th, we were again welcomed by rain, which immediately froze and turned into black ice. This became another misfortune for my comrades at the front. November 30th. At noon on the last day of November, the thermometer rose above 0 Celsius again. It was clear and sunny. Heavy defensive battles continued on the front line. The enemy's attacks were repulsed. Intense mortar fire from the Russians made life very difficult for us. Hauptmann Israel, who commanded our battalion after Major Weigert's departure, was killed by a shrapnel hit. The remnants of the 2nd and 3rd battalions were merged into one unit, named Kraus's Combat Group. Oberleutnant Kraus was promoted to the rank of Hauptmann. He was a cold-blooded and imperturbable native of East Prussia, who knew his business well. His adjutant was Lieutenant Gerlach, a native of Saarland, by profession a teacher at a technical school. Up until recently, he had commanded a platoon in the 14th Anti-Tank Company. December 1st. About noon on December 1st, when the weather cleared, we were able to observe an air battle between 2 German and 2 Russian planes. However, no one was shot down. I think our guys were low on gasoline because they suddenly turned around and flew away. The Russians didn't pursue them. In the evening, we received bad news about the commander of our regiment. Colonel Gross did not survive a severe wound and was drafted into the Army of the Most High. He was 57 years of age. We all respected and honored him as a man and as a superior. Who will succeed him? We were constantly suffering losses, and no replenishment was expected. In this connection, the rear units were sifted every now and then. Everyone who was available was sent to the front line. Winter has also arrived, at least outwardly. On the night of December 1st to 2nd, it snowed. Everything around, as far as the eye could see, was wrapped in white. In my opinion, it looked like a huge shroud that carefully covered all our sorrows and sufferings here. December 4th. On December 4th, I called my cousin Willie Nussbaum. He was very close by, at Major Voda's headquarters, in the 1st Battalion of the 79th Motorized Regiment. We agreed to try to meet the next day. Our soldiers, and I too, were firmly convinced that we would be rescued from the cauldron. Everywhere they were saying, "Hold on, and the Fuhrer will rescue you." Until then, we must hold our positions by all possible means. December 5th. I still managed to see my cousin briefly. We had never met him before, but we understood each other immediately. Unfortunately, we were both called away by duty, but we hoped that we could still find a chance to talk. December 5th, 6 and 7 were costly for the remnants of the 276th Battalion of Kraus's battle group. On December 5th, Oberleutnant Schultz was killed at the height of 147.6, and on December 6th, Lieutenant Pills was killed near the railroad embankment. On December 7th, Lieutenant Baumann was shot in the head at the same embankment. Besides them, some of the old service soldiers and non-commissioned officers were killed at this time, such as my messenger, Oberfurter Kurt Willmann, Oberfurter Kerner, who had formerly served in the 8th Company, non-commissioned officer Feldman, and some other tried and experienced fighters. Those of the soldiers who contracted hepatitis had to stay in their units. Hepatitis patients were returned to their units from field hospitals. If this continues, this is how any of us will be treated when it is our turn. The Russians were trying to knock us out of our weak defensive positions, which were the exact opposite of the former northern defensive line, once and for all, and then capture the heights of 147.6, 144.2, and 135.4, which are south of the railroad track. My comrades on the front line worked miracles, which could hardly be demanded of them. They fought defensive battles, all day long in the snow, in the cold. They did not have the necessary clothing and equipment for such battles, but they continued to stubbornly defend every square meter of ground. Our neighbors on the left were not in a better position. As far as I could tell, they were better equipped with winter uniforms, but they, like us, had to bear the brunt of the fierce defensive fighting. By this time, Combat Group Rheinisch had been transferred to Combat Group Krauss. The right flank of the 79th Motorized Regiment and the left flank of the remnants of the former 276th Infantry Grenadier Regiment were now called the Krauss Combat Group, and they again had to find themselves on the edge of enemy strikes. The battles boiled mainly around the height of 147.6, which the Ivans attacked continuously by forces up to a company of infantry supported by tanks. The front line was broken through twice, and up to the present moment our soldiers managed to repel the enemy again. But how long could this continue?